My name is William Roca. I am the Director of Programs at Village Preservation. So before we start our presentation, I just want to tell you a little bit about Village Preservation. But can I get a show of hands, who is a member of Village Preservation? Thank you very much. The rest of you, shame, shame, shame. Before you leave, please come and see me and take one of these membership sign-up brochures. Now, if you're not familiar with Village Preservation, you can go ahead and scan that QR code or get one of these handy-dandy brochures that also has the QR code. Village Preservation was founded back in 1980, and we are here to help protect the architectural, cultural, and historical legacy of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've gotten over 1,250 buildings landmarked, and we do about 75 to 80, and this is actually our 80th program this year, tonight, a year. Nearly all of them are free, whether you're a member or not, but we are a member-based organization, so we could really use your support. But if you just want to learn a little bit more about us, head over to villagepreservation.org, take a look at some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow is our very final event of 2024. You can watch it from the comfort of your home. It is a webinar. But you can also take a look at our website, learn a little bit more about the advocacy work that we do in our neighborhoods, sign up for more programs, and check out some of the free resources, one of which will be highlighted today. We have a number of maps all about our neighborhoods. You can design your own walking tours to learn about the buildings and people that lived in the neighborhood and really explore it in more detail. That's all free for you to take advantage of, whether you are a member or not. If you see what you like, please do consider becoming a member. Individual membership starts at $50 a year, and that gives you early access to all of our programs, so you can get first dibs on our programs. But now to introduce this evening's speakers. I have it printed off here so I don't put it in there. All right, Dena Tasse-Winter is a historic preservationist, writer, and Village Preservation's own Director of Research and Preservation. A native New Yorker and Greenwich Village resident, she holds an MA in Historic Preservation and Cultural Heritage Management from the University of York in the UK, and a BA in Music History from the University of Rochester. And she is joined also this evening by Chloe Gregoire, a Village Preservation's Research and Preservation Associate. Born and raised here in New York City, she spent her life captivated by the city's buildings and their history. She holds a BA in Urban Studies and Classic from Hunter College. So welcome, Dena and Chloe. I will hand it over to you.
Great. Well, I also have a loud voice because I'm a trained singer, but I've got this microphone here too, so we'll figure out the best way. Let me just load up the full presentation here. Fabulous. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm honored to lead our penultimate program of the season for Village Preservation. And as William said, I will be joined in a little bit by Chloe, who she and I work very closely together, and we put together all of the research for this resource that I'm going to tell you all about. And you'll be able to explore it further at your own pleasure from home later on, but I'm going to get into a lot of the details of what our digital story map tells, and also some further tidbits about the history of the avenue that you won't find there, that you'll only find here during this presentation. So we're going to go on a journey along Fifth Avenue. Of course, we were also very thankful to get to do the program in this space here that is along Fifth Avenue, and spoiler alert, we're going to talk about the history of this very building in a little while, which will be fun. But we're going to look at Fifth Avenue through time, and as I've already sort of mentioned, Chloe and I spent many months, most of 2024 really, gearing up for this great anniversary, which is the Bicentennial of Fifth Avenue. It officially opened on November 1st, 1824, or at least the first segment of it did. And that segment goes from Washington Square North to 13th Street. So the segment that we're currently in, that Village Preservation cares about in Greenwich Village. And so we were really excited to get to celebrate 200 years of history along the avenue. And we wanted to dig into the history of every single building and every single lot along the avenue. And as you'll learn throughout the course of this presentation, some of the buildings, about 8 of them, I believe, between Washington Square North and 14th Street are the original structures that were built mostly in the 1830s and 40s that are still standing today, which is really amazing to see. And then the vast majority of buildings along the avenue are currently in what we're calling their second generation. So there was one iteration of a building that was constructed in the early 1800s that's been demolished at some point and replaced with a second structure, and that's what we've got now. But one of the really exciting things that Chloe and I were able to do during this research was find photographs of every building that's ever been along the avenue. So including those first phase structures that many of which have been long gone since the turn of the century or even the late 1800s, they were demolished. So none of us could have possibly seen those buildings in real life, and in many cases it took us some digging to find those photographs. And so we're really proud to be able to present this map that shows all of those images so you can get a real picture of what Lower Fifth Avenue looked like at any point in time. And a little bit later in the presentation, well, sooner than later, I'm going to show you some of those images that we were able to find and source. And a bit later, Chloe's going to tell you a little bit more about how we sourced those images and some of the resources that we used to get there. So we all know Fifth Avenue, and this was just a collage of what you might think of when you just first think of Fifth Avenue. Of course, it's one of the most iconic thoroughfares in New York City. People around the world who don't even know much about New York know Fifth Avenue, whether they know it or not. The Empire State Buildings along Fifth Avenue, Central Park, the Met, the Museum Mile, Saks Fifth Avenue, all of these places that you see here, and many, many more. And so it's got residences, hotels, retail, restaurants, imposing architecture, and living on Fifth Avenue is one of the most coveted addresses you could have. But it's also happens to be that Lower Fifth Avenue, which may not have, the Empire State Building, though you can see it from here, or any of those kind of initial monumental places you might think of. Lower Fifth Avenue is really a microcosm of what all of Fifth Avenue is and what all of New York City is. I really love seeing this full view here from the park because, as I mentioned, you can see the Empire State Building in the distance, but you can also see a lot of the things that make Lower Fifth Avenue so special and kind of the layers of history over time that we'll get to dig a little deeper into soon. So, you've got the Washington Square Arch, which was installed in 1895, permanently anyway, and the Washington Square North Row, which is, I'm sure many of you know it, but these little red brick buildings here that we'll talk about more in a little bit, from 1832, some of the earliest in this view. And then you can see 1 Fifth Avenue, which is that towering structure behind it, which to this day kind of defines the skyline of Greenwich Village, and certainly was kind of epic proportions when it was first constructed in 1926. 2 Fifth Avenue on the other side of the street from the 1950s, and the Empire State Building from 1930 in the distance. So you're kind of seeing this layering of architecture over time. And on Lower Fifth Avenue, I'm going to say Lower Fifth Avenue a lot, and I mean the edge of the park to 14th Street, and that's what we're really focusing on during the course of this conversation. But we've also got wonderful places like the Tasse-Winter Club, which is one of those 8 original buildings that's still standing. We have multiple educational institutions, including the one we're currently in, and so much more to discover. So let's dig in. So that was we just looked at a current view, of course, everybody knows it, of Washington Square Park. looking toward the avenue. And then here we are a full century earlier. This is an image from 1910. And if you look at it, you know, it doesn't look the same as things look today. There's a lot missing. A lot of those skyscrapers and taller buildings are missing. But would you recognize this if you were to suddenly be deposited on this version of the avenue? You probably would. I mean, some of the buildings are the same, and you certainly get the sense, even in this image from 1910, that you're in a really busy urban environment. It's a prominent thoroughfare. You can tell that the city is kind of like rising all around it. You'll see more of this and kind of how the early 1900s was sort of on the precipice of change on Fifth Avenue, and we can compare before and after in a little bit. But if we go back another century, you probably would not recognize this as much. Here we are in kind of a farm landscape, and this is what the avenue, or what the pre-avenue looked like before it was officially laid out, beginning in 1824. So in the 1820s and prior to the 1820s, this neighborhood, this part of Greenwich Village that we're in and that we're talking about, was mostly farmland, mostly owned by a few select families. Certain names that you'll hear come up time and again as we continue to talk this evening: the Gregoire family, the Lennox family, and further east, the Stuyvesant family. These kind of prominent names that had vast holdings throughout this part of what was really the northernmost edge of New York City in the 1700s and early 1800s. And so there were also still Native American trails and some country lanes that had been developed, but those were really the only means of traversing the landscape. There was no grid yet. Well, the grid was created in 1811, at least on paper, but it took quite some time to build it all out, and that was the case too for Fifth Avenue. There was Minetta Creek, which you may have heard about, or at least you know Minetta Lane today, which follows the path of partially of Minetta Creek. So there were all these natural landscape features, and certainly nothing like the city we know now. But you know, back then they were figuring out what to do with this island, and the city was really mostly down by Wall Street, and like I said, farmland up above. And as part of the 1811 Commissioner's Plan, that was the first time that a Fifth Avenue was ever called out by name or ever laid out on paper to become this bisecting avenue through almost all of Manhattan. Today, it goes 7 miles from Washington Square North all the way up to 143rd Street in Harlem, with really few interruptions. I mean, you've got Central Park alongside it and all kinds of other things going on, but it really extends the full length. But it took time to develop that, and it was approved in several phases. So kind of overall, the city was growing and progressing northward. So as I said, it started, you know, further south, closer to Wall Street, all of that. Greenwich Village was already growing and developing, but it took time, and also there were other complications, such as, you know, the city had to acquire the land to be able to build all these streets. And so in order to build Fifth Avenue, they did first acquire the stretch from Washington Square North to 13th Street, that little bit from 13th to 14th, which is in Chloe and my research study area, and you'll see a little bit more about that block. Was not included in that first bit. That actually came a couple of decades later, I think, or at least several years later. But when they voted to approve, the city council voted to approve the avenue on September 27th, 1824, they had a vision for this entire avenue, but like I said, the lower Fifth Avenue portion opened on November 1st, and I believe the final portion of the avenue that was acquired was actually between 130th and 135th Streets. That was the last segment that they finally acquired in the late 1800s, 1880s. And so this map that you're looking at here goes to, I think, 35th Street or so, 34th, 35th. And you can see pretty clearly on this, I've highlighted the portion that is up to 14th Street, and you can see that by 1849, which is when this map is from, that portion was already quite built out, 25 years after they officially acquired land to be able to start to build there. But even as you only approach, the 20s and 30s on the right side of the map, it's still predominantly farmland. And so you can imagine that as you progressed further north, it was even more and more still wild and not really built out yet. But our part of the city was rapidly growing. So we counted up all the buildings. There's approximately 40 buildings between Washington Square North and 14th Street. It's 14 blocks in total. I mean, really 7 blocks north to south, but you've got the east and west sides of the street. So 14 blocks, 40 buildings. And as I mentioned, only 8 or 9 of them are the first and only iterations of buildings that have ever been on the avenue, and then another 24 are the second. There's only 4 buildings that have had a third generation, and I'll take you through some of that to see how that all happened. So I wanted to start with the mansions. Fifth Avenue, parts of Fifth Avenue to this day, as we've already discussed a little bit, are kind of a prominent residential address to have. They've always been the home of the wealthy, Fifth Avenue. And that was the case from the beginning. So a lot of these mansions and some of these great photographs that we're going to start looking at now, I'm starting with the ones that are no longer with us. So you get to see some of these great images that we found, these archival images that show what the avenue looked like starting in the 1830s. I'm going mostly in chronological order for now, so you can see 24 Fifth Avenue, 1834. That's kind of about when, 8 or 9 years after the avenue was established, they actually started building and getting rid of that farmland and turning it into these mansions or stately homes. So this is 24 Fifth Avenue on the west side between 9th and 10th Streets. And you'll see we jump around a bit, but really in these early years, the majority of the avenue ended up being full of these types of grand houses. So 1 to 7 Fifth Avenue is on the east side near 8th Street. And you can start to see the kind of different typologies or architectural details. I'm an architectural historian, so I love to kind of notice all of these details. You can see the windows that have these multi-light grids, and the cornices at the top these ones are called dentalated cornices because they have these little bits that look like teeth, sort of. And often they would be built in pairs or rows, but there were also examples that were built as standalone mansions, which is such a rarity to imagine now because we're so built out here in Lower Manhattan that we don't have any space for that. But back then, like I said, farmland, so they could kind of do as they pleased. Here's another example of an even more intricate kind of parapet at the top, and you can see as we progress through the years, and we're still only in 1845, but things start to get even more elaborate often. This one's between 12th and 13th Street, so we're starting to pop up along the full stretch of Lower Fifth Avenue. This one is at the southwest corner of 10th Street and 5th Avenue. And you can, is this the one? Yes, it was the first building to feature a mansard roof, which is that kind of decorative angled roof at the top of the building. And you'll see a couple others pop up throughout this presentation, but this was the very first one. Then here, 21 5th Avenue, it was on the east side between 10th and 11th Street. And this was known as the Mark Twain House, or at least eventually it was, because the author lived here for a few years, starting in 1904. And the building was demolished in 1954, and you'll see later a lot of these buildings were demolished throughout many decades. 54 is pretty late though. A lot of them, as you'll soon see, were demolished closer to the turn of the century in favor of larger apartment buildings, many of the apartment buildings that you see today along the avenue. But this one lasted until 1954, which was just 15 years before the Landmarks Preservation Commission designated the Greenwich Village Historic District, which, if that had happened in a different order, the building would have been saved. So I always think it's fascinating as a preservationist and historian to think about how close were we to saving something before it ended up going away. And that's actually a theme that will come up a little bit later, and you'll see why. Then this one I think is just a really beautiful photograph by Bernice Abbott, who was a wonderful photographer and villager and captured many of the beautiful buildings in our neighborhood. But these were kind of on the later side of the single family homes that were constructed along the avenue before things started to change. So that quick kind of survey gives you a sense of how many of these grand mansions in different types were kind of dotting the entire avenue. And if you explore our full map later on your own time on your computer, you can see we've actually laid it out a little bit differently there. We've laid it out exactly block by block, so you can kind of like walk yourself along the avenue over time and see how things change. But I wanted to do it this way to kind of show you the phasing of the avenue tonight. So as I just hinted, things were about to change. So you can see that starting here. This was the Brevoort Hotel, and that's that name Brevoort again. Henry Brevoort and his family had a lot of land in this part of the neighborhood. So around mid-century, priorities were starting to shift, and the people in the neighborhood were starting to want to build bigger and bring more classy people into the area, and they started establishing hotels in order to do that. And so this particular hotel was actually adapted from some pre-1850s buildings. On the very right of the screen, that lower building is what they all kind of would have looked like. At some point, they combined 3 or 4 of the row houses, built them up another floor, and introduced that pediment at the top to make it this one cohesive building. But so I was talking before about how there's like different phases, 1, 2, or 3 phases of construction along the avenue, and we're counting this as still the first phase because it really did retain the structural integrity and the facades of the original houses that were here, but just adaptively reused them. But yeah, so this is actually one of the few cases where Chloe and I were not able to find the very original view of the buildings, because our goal was to know what this building looked like before it was modified, but because the Brevoort Hotel was such a famous building at the time, and for whatever reason we haven't found any retained images of what the original road looked like. But luckily, we know that it was part of the row of the one that you can see at the edge, so you can still get a sense of what it would have looked like. And then I wanted to show a couple of other examples of hotels. So there were 3 or 4 at least prominent hotels that came in the 1870s, starting with the Brevoort that we just looked at. And this one's an interesting case because it's one of very few examples along Lower Fifth where the original mansion didn't make it until at least the turn of the century. So, these mansions originally were being built between the 1830s and 1850s mostly, and they were standing for at least half a century, if not more. But in this one case, there was a small freestanding mansion, which was just number 37 Fifth Avenue, built probably prior to the 1840s. And it had a garden, and it was just like kind of a standalone little building in open space. And so I suppose a developer thought, this was a great opportunity to build out a hotel as they started to think about how well hotels would do along the avenue. And so it was demolished, and this hotel building was constructed in 1872, the Grosvenor Apartments. Sometimes you'll see there's kind of various ways that things are labeled. There's like apartment house hotels, apartment hotels, and they kind of all mean, they're not necessarily synonymous, but they're close. It was kind of the early days of discovering what an apartment building should be, and often the hotels had long-term tenants, so it might be more akin to what we would think of even as just an apartment building with rental units, but they would have considered it a hotel. So that's some of the nomenclature that you might see. And then one more hotel here. This one was actually a vacant lot. It remained vacant into the 1870s, which was quite rare. Almost every lot had at least some structure on it by then. But this one was filled with a purpose-built hotel in the 1870s also. And it was demolished in 1939. And I don't have a lot of demolition photos, but I just thought that it was really cool to get to see it. So whenever I could, I included them. I think it's really interesting to see kind of like the buildings in the midst of change instead of just a before and after. And we have a few more of these scattered throughout our map too. And this one actually came from a really interesting collection from New York Public Library's digital collection that Chloe will mention in a little bit as well. So now we've progressed into the turn of the century, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the larger apartment buildings that really, at that point, were kind of cropping up everywhere along Fifth Avenue. And I'm sure if you've walked along Fifth Avenue, which I know you all have because here we are, it won't be a surprise that many of the mansions became apartment buildings. That's what we see today. Almost every apartment building that was built between, say, 1903 and 1950, though most of them were in the 10s and 20s, are still standing. And there's a few reasons for that, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But this one's on the east side of Fifth Avenue between 11th and 12th Street. And there's a bunch, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly because they're all still standing, and you should go and look at them for yourselves and look at some of the architectural details and see how they progressed. Oh yeah, so this one was a rendering of it, so I wanted to just show the full building as well. Here we are on the east side of Fifth Avenue between 12th and 13th Street, right across the street from where we are right now. So when you walk out tonight, it'll be dark, but you can see this very facade. And keep it in mind and kind of where we are in space in mind for the future, because there's some really interesting things going on in terms of layers of history, both across the street and in our building and next to us that I'll get into in a moment. This one's on the east side between 9th and 10th Streets. And I also just wanted to point out that the text that you're seeing alongside some of these images are excerpts from our digital map and guide. And so for the most part, they hopefully stand alone, but if anything seems like, what is she talking about? It's like following an earlier thought that she never had. It's because it's a screenshot from our maps. But hopefully I'm explaining enough so that you get the sense of it without it, and then you can look later and get the full story. So like in this case, for example, the details and the text are telling you that this was 3 different lots that were combined into one to make these larger apartment building, which happened a lot. A lot of times, several mansions or row houses that were in a row together were simultaneously demolished. The lots were combined, and that's why now along the avenue you sometimes only see 1, 2, or 3 buildings along the full avenue, whereas originally there would have been 6 or even 8 different lots in most cases. So just quickly flip through a few more, and you can see that we're progressing through time. So as I sort of mentioned, the 1920s was really the heart of when this was happening. Most of these were being built in the 10s and 20s, and kind of unsurprisingly came to a bit of a grinding halt with the Great Depression, and then a couple more came in post-war. This is another great action, not really action, action shot of the building under construction, which I just love. A few more. The building on the left of this one, that little holdout, is an important one that we'll get to soon. And this one replaced the Hotel Grosvenor, which was one of those hotels we were talking about from 1872. And that really makes it the only case of 3 phases of construction, because remember, that was the one where there was a little house with a garden that was demolished prior to 1872. But this is the only case, really, of 3 phases, with the exception of a couple of buildings that were built very recently, like in 2010 or so. So it's really incredible. You walk along Fifth Avenue and you're mostly seeing what somebody from 1935 would have seen. This one's from 1926. And here's 1 Fifth Avenue, the lovely 1 Fifth Avenue that we saw earlier. And then, like I said, a couple beyond the 1930s. This one's from 1940 and then 1953, and you can see that the architectural style is quite different from the early part of the century. So why do all of these apartments still exist? Why haven't there been more phases of construction? There are a few reasons, but one reason, which I touched on a little bit already, is the Greenwich Village Historic District. It was designated in 1969, and most of these buildings, that were built between the 1920s and 1950s were pretty new at that point, and they all had tenants in them, and they were these large apartment buildings, so within the decades immediately following their construction, they weren't going to be demolished. And by the 1960s, they became landmarked, which meant that no significant alterations and certainly no demolition could happen without very serious review by the city. And there's only been one case so far where demolition has been approved along Fifth Avenue within the historic district, and I'll show you that as well. But also then the blue line here is the edge of Village Preservation's proposed south of Union Square Historic District. So you can see that the majority of Fifth Avenue, which I've highlighted in yellow, is within that. There's one notable cutout, and I'll show you why now. It's the new school building across the street that you can very clearly see when you exit this building, and that was constructed in 2009. Demolished some a very interesting building in its stead, which some of you may remember. I grew up in the neighborhood. I don't know why I can't remember it, but I'm sure I walked past it a million times. But same thing for 61 Fifth Avenue, which is on the south side of the street, across the street from here. So 61 was previously this Schraft's restaurant, which is just kind of a cool structure that was there since the 30s. And then this is the building I was just talking about that I must have seen countless times, but it was a full block Lane's department store. And then later the new school did acquire it and made some modifications. You can see if you flip between these two photos how much the windows changed, because they wanted to be able to use it for classrooms and different things. But yeah, if they wanted more space, they had the zoning permissions to do it. So in 2009, they built the new building that's there now. So now that we understand how much has changed in these kind of different phases, I wanted to quickly take a few minutes to look at the 8 or so buildings that are the originals that are still with us. So I've used this base map, which is the 1854 Paris map, which is really cool to see because you can get a sense of how many buildings were built out in 1854 and how much vacant land there still was. So you can see here in the 1850s, we're about 30 years after the avenue was created, and a lot had already been built, but there also was much more open space than we have now, that's for sure. So we're starting, I'm also, again, going chronologically here. So starting in 1832, the very earliest buildings to be built along the avenue and along Washington Square North, the Row, I'm sure you all know it. And this one's got a lot of interesting preservation history to it. The entire building, again, I love the construction shots. Here's some 1939 scaffolding. How safe do you think that was? But this row of buildings, you can see that they made some modifications. Like here, they're altering the roof, but the facades of the buildings have been retained since their original iterations. So just flip through a bit to get to the Landmarks Preservation Commission designation photograph, which shows the whole row here. So it's now an apartment building, but the facades were retained, and so it looks pretty much exactly as it always did. So then this is my other favorite view, looking through the arch to lower Fifth Avenue prior to the construction of one Fifth Avenue behind the row. But here's the row. It still looks like it always did. And then here's that view, a century later or so, showing one Fifth Avenue, but you've still got that same row in the foreground. And this is pretty much what it looks like today. I mean, ignore the other side of the street, there's a new building there, but yeah. Okay, So as you can see, we're jumping around a little bit geographically. Much like how I had said the entirety of Fifth Avenue was kind of built here and there, a little bit piecemeal, not exactly linearly. The same thing is true of this micro scale of our lower Fifth Avenue. Conversion of farmland into mansions wasn't linear. Different owners wanted to do different things or kind of got on board with the whole mansion plan at different points in time. But pay attention to where we are now, because that highlighted building is just next door to the building that we're in. Okay, so yes, all the way to the right, that little building there is the one in question that is still standing today. But as you can see, this was once a full block of row houses, so it's so incredible that we still have this one row house that looks kind of like what the rest of the row did, at least in terms of height and scale. And you can go look at it and say, oh, the whole block looked like this before. It looks pretty much nothing like that now. And this is that building. It was altered over time to serve commercial uses, but it's still there. So going back to this kind of view, if you take a look at the two buildings in the middle, that is where we are now, the one that's a little bit taller and then a little bit shorter to its left. This is one more case of Chloe and myself not being able to find the very first phase of photography because the building that's taller, which is actually number 66, the part of the building that we're in, would have originally been at the same level as all of the other row houses, but this was once it had been modified. And then here, this should look more familiar. This is much more akin to how it looks today. And the two buildings were combined at the interior. So this one, I'm not sure whether to call it a first phase or a second phase building. I guess technically it's first phase, but it's really been altered so drastically. But yeah, this whole block is quite interesting, and I wanted to just quickly pop in either direction too. So on one side of us, we've got 65th Avenue, which replaced a mansion and became the expanded headquarters of Macmillan Company, which was originally in this building and then it expanded over. And this building then later housed Forbes magazine, and it's listed in the National Register of Historic Places for both its architectural and cultural significance. Then on the other side, heading north, we've got 75th Avenue, which is a Beaux-Arts style loft building that housed the national office of the NAACP from 1914 to 1923, among many other civil rights organizations and prominent publishers. And it has a really fascinating history. And so it became a landmark in 2021, just recently. It's part of our South of Union Square Historic District, but LPC chose to designate certain specific buildings, at least for now. We're still fighting for that. So then the next two buildings that are still standing today are our beautiful ecclesiastical architecture along the avenue. So first we've got the Church of the Ascension, built in 1840 to 41, and still looks just about how it always did. It's a brownstone facade, which is a material that deteriorates over time just from the air and moisture in the air, but it's been repaired as needed over the years, but it's still there looking much as it did. And then just one block away, we've got the other prominent church along the avenue, 48 Fifth Avenue, the First Presbyterian Church. There's a third church, Grace Church, which was being constructed just a couple blocks away in 1847. So these prominent families who were living in the neighborhood, they were all members of these congregations, and they were kind of the impetus for bringing these churches to these particular locations. And I just think this is a really unique example of a much more modern building kind of being integrated into the architecture of the original church building. And then we've got this cute little row in between the two churches, which looks so interesting. It has a mansard roof in one corner, it's got kind of like all different details going on, but unfortunately demolished, so we don't have this view anymore, and it became yet another apartment building. So heading back south, in 1849 to 1850, this row of 4 buildings was constructed all at the same time, but only the corner one remains. And this is a bit of a complicated situation, which if you're a Village Preservation member or have been kind of interested in what's going on in this part of the neighborhood, it's been a bit contentious, and I'll show you why. So it was originally a row of 4, just one last example of us not finding the very oldest photographs, but being able to capture this 12 after it was altered, and 10 and 14 in their original state, and they would have originally all matched. So just showing another view of the original matching row. And 10 Fifth Avenue was altered also to incorporate commercial use at the ground floor, but it's always been residential at upper floors. And you can see that the facades of 14 and 16, which were the end of the row, were stripped of a lot of their details. And that's how they were when they were designated by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And in part because of that, LPC ended up approving their demolition, the only buildings that have been demolished within the historic district since its designation along Fifth Avenue. And there are very few throughout Greenwich Village, but specifically on the avenue, this is the only one. And this is the rendering of what's been approved. So much larger, and we fought to get it lowered. It was originally even much taller than that. So at least hopefully it's a little bit more contextual now, but it's been a very contentious project, and I don't know if you have walked past that part of the avenue recently, but they're building very quickly. So you can go see it instead of just the rendering. So across the street from the church, 1852 to 53, was this lovely row of houses, each built within a few years of each other. And 47, which is on the right side here, is known today as the Salmagundi Club. It's been that way since the early 1900s. They've been the caretakers of that building. And at some point, its facade was stripped a little bit. As you can see here, some of those details around the windows are gone. But happily, Salmagundi is a great caretaker of their building, and they've restored a ton of those details, and it's really looking great now. And I just thought it's really interesting to see the whole row. Salmagundi as the standout, see the whole block, and all of the larger apartment buildings, but Salmagundi is also an individual landmark, so it's not going anywhere. And then across the street from where we are right now, I think this is the last of our extant original buildings. 59 Fifth Avenue, at the right in this photograph, this kind of very old, blurry photograph. It was built circa 1853 as part of a row, and you can see peeking out in the corner is that Schraff's restaurant, which was originally also a row house, but many changes along this particular stretch of the avenue, especially because it's close to Union Square, so a lot of the commercial impact of that led to greater changes than you would see closer to Washington Square Park. Another great under construction photo showing the original row house that was replaced by Schraff's under construction. Wait, where did it go? It was these two, the other two, are still there. So that is great to see. And then I couldn't get enough of the Schraff's building and what it turned into, so I had to include that. But yeah, so that's kind of a very brief overview of some of what you can see and the layers of history that you can see. And so I want to turn it over to Chloe just for a few minutes to talk about how we found some of these photographs, especially the more difficult to source ones.
Hi everybody. So my name is Chloe. It's great to talk to everyone and see everyone from this way and sitting up here. But thank you for such a great presentation. I'm going to show you how I found some of the historic photos that were a little more difficult to find. So there was a mix of resources. A lot of the photos came from the different archives and historical institutions such as the New York Historical Society, the Museum of the City of New York Public Library, and our own archives. Then some of the other ones came from different publications from around the time period we were looking at, and these are the covers of some of those publications, and I'll get into what's inside of them. So, Old Buildings of New York City was published in 1907, and by Brentano's, a bookstore chain. This was accessed via the Library of Congress, and it includes backstories and photos of a variety of buildings around the city. And some of the buildings on Lower Fifth Avenue that were included in it were the Lenox Mansion, which is in the center of the image, and the Minter Mansion, which was across the street from it. Those were both on the border of Fifth Avenue and 12th Street, so right here, and the First Presbyterian Church. The next one was a super valuable resource, and I think you might have seen some of the photos that were from these books throughout the presentation. It was called Collins's Gold Sides of Fifth Avenue, and it was published in 1910, and it included, the beginning of the book had some backstory to the history of the avenue, written in kind of funny language, which I wish I had on hand, but I don't. And then it had photos of the street, and I don't know if you can see at the bottom of the image, but it actually had the name of the building or who might have owned the building or lived there at the time. So it was very helpful in putting it together. The next book, the next invaluable resource was Fifth Avenue, New York from start to finish, which is made in 1911. Interestingly enough, was 100 years after the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which actually was the first time that Fifth Avenue was laid out on a map. And I found this book to be interesting when looked at together with the 1910 image, because some of the images in this one are cut off, and but it shows how they all look together in terms of the streetscape, and while the other one would have taken them out of context. When you look them together, you kind of understand better how the street would have looked. And this doesn't just include Washington Square to 14th, it includes all the way up. And I'm planning to send out links to everyone so you can casually browse this on your own time. What's also interesting about this is the New York Public Library, it's accessed from the New York Public Library, and they note that this was made 4 years after the founding of the Fifth Avenue Association, which was founded by a group of merchants and residents who were becoming increasingly concerned by industries moving into the avenue and changing its historic character. So they think that the photographer Burton Wells, who took these wide-angle shots of the street, might have been inspired by like a somewhat burgeoning historic preservation movement at that time. The next research is Fifth Avenue Old and New, published in 1924 in honor of the 100th anniversary of the avenue, and was actually published by the Fifth Avenue Association, and you can see the graphic of them at the top of the slide. And this included context for both the avenue and some of the surrounding streets. Like here we have some information about the McDougal Alley artist colony. This is the Spinkler Farm, which I know was included earlier in the presentation, which would have been located at Fifth Avenue and 14th Street. And this was also mentioned, Percy Loomis Spare photos. This was particularly interesting, at least to me, to learn about the context of them, because he was hired by the New York Public Library to take photos of many buildings around New York City between the 1920s and 1940s, and he took over 30,000 different photos of the city. And many of them capture the same location, taken decades, like a decade apart, so they can show the changes that were made when different buildings were altered. Including here, the middle photos show the row of Washington Square North under construction, and those were included in the presentation. And the different buildings being demolished and the different stages at which they were at. The next resource is New York City tax photos, which I'm not sure if any of you guys would be familiar with, but I hope you have explored them, because it's probably, I would argue, the most thorough historical documentation of the entire city. They were taken by the city government with funds by the WPA, mainly between 1939 and 1941, and there's basically a photo of every single building in New York City as it would have looked at that time. So I encourage you to explore. I'll send out the links. And then that's it. So there's
addition to the photographs and the resources that Chloe just shared, we, as I sort of touched upon a little bit with that 1854 Paris map, we also used mapping and kind of combination of photographs and maps to piece together the footprints of buildings, what we knew existed at certain points in time based on the photographic documentation, and then referring back to maps. I found maps. The New York Public Library has a host of many historical maps of New York City, starting in the 1850s and going all the way through, a century or more. And I found as many maps as I could between 1850 and 1900 to get a sense of how the footprints of the buildings kind of shifted and changed, so you could pinpoint exactly when, for example, 3 row houses would have been combined and turned into a larger building, such as an apartment building. And then we would double check that with some of the photographs, and also tax records. And there are a few different ways to kind of identify when historic buildings were constructed, but it's much easier to do so if the building is still standing, because the Department of Buildings and other city agencies keep record of existing buildings. But we learned throughout the course of this research that buildings that are demolished earlier on, especially some of the mansions that were demolished in the late 1800s, the Department of Buildings said, why would we need records of something that doesn't even exist? Which is kind of crazy to think about now, especially as a researcher who wants to understand what our city used to look like. But yeah, so it was much more difficult to get concrete written evidence of when certain things happened in those earlier years. So Chloe and I devised this kind of two-pronged approach of mapping and photographs to piece it together. And the last thing I wanted to mention for now, this QR code takes you to our map, but you can also type that in or just go to our website and find it. And there's much more to see there, including some of the cultural history. I mean, there's just so much, even in recent years, music and art and dance, and I mentioned civil rights and book publishers, and a ton has happened on this 7-block span of Fifth Avenue, so I really encourage you to learn more. Yes, so thank you so much. We do have a few minutes for questions. If there aren't any, I'd be happy, or Chloe and I would be happy to answer any. So that was. Oh, and I can go back.
The first painting that was exhibited, where is it now and who painted it?
This one of the farm at 14th Street and 5th Avenue. So I don't actually know if there's a physical, original painting still somewhere in a gallery, but we found it in this 5th Avenue old and new resource that Chloe mentioned, which had tons of great, not only photographs, but other paintings and illustrations and lithographs and things of the time. So yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know if it's hanging somewhere, but that's the only place that I've ever seen it, at least in my searchings. Yes.
I have a question. You said that Fifth Avenue opened up in 1824, but clearly there was a street there. What did you mean by it opened up in 1824?
So, as I mentioned, the Commissioner's Grid of 1811 was when they first laid out kind of a full grid for all of Manhattan, and that included Fifth Avenue among pretty much most of the other avenues that we currently have. And some of the avenues, including portions of Fifth Avenue, were already country lanes, at least to a certain extent. I don't know exactly how far what we now know as Fifth Avenue extended prior to 1811, but I think in certain cases, the Commissioner's Grid kind of mapped out some streets that already existed. In a lot of cases, it was streets that didn't exist, and they were more winding paths that the Commissioner's Grid really regulated, and that's why we have such a regulated grid pattern in New York City, with the exception of parts of Greenwich Village. But the reason I said it officially opened on November 1st, 1824 is because the City Council of New York You know, 1811 is when the grid was laid out, but they didn't start construction right away or start doing anything with it quite yet. That was just kind of the first iteration of the map. And for Fifth Avenue in particular, the city council met in September, I believe it was September 27th of 1824, and said, you've got the green light, go ahead, we should officially open the avenue. And on that day in September, they said November 1st is when we're going to formally open Washington Square North, which was actually called Art Street back then, through to 13th Street. So that's why November 1st is the day that we're celebrating the bicentennial.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, it was really nice. I have a question about, you mentioned a holdout, but you never circled back.
I'm not sure which.
A holdout or holdover?
One
One of the buildings?
the original buildings that.
Yes.
You know what? Actually, I think it was. I think I was talking, if I'm recalling my words correctly. It was. You see this large apartment building, and next to it, a tiny little
Yes.
3 or 4 story brownstone, and that is the Salmagundi Club at 47
Oh, okay.
Fifth Avenue. That is the only holdout on that particular stretch of the avenue, with large apartment buildings on either side.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are any of these books available to the public? I'm interested to look at your map, but also just seeing the full picture at that time.
Yeah, they're all freely accessible online.
And we're gonna send out
Yeah.
a follow-up email that will include all of those links that Chloe's
Some of them are
put
like
together.
Library of Congress, other ones are your public library, but I'll send out the links.
Yeah, and on our Fifth Avenue map, in most cases, or we tried our best to, you know, put a caption for every photograph to say where it came from, and then you can refer back to the original, the primary source if you're interested in that link.
I was just curious, are there any water towers on any of the buildings that, because New York is known for that?
It needs to be at a certain height, because the water pressure will go up, I don't know, 4, 6, 8 stories, and you don't need a water tank. It's at a certain height, you then pump the water up to the water tank, so then by gravity it comes down. But I can't tell you offhand what that height is.
Interesting. Yeah, 1/5 has one, and I believe that building is like 18 or 19 stories, and there's some others, a lot of these, you know, early 20th century apartment buildings I would imagine, be tall enough to necessitate that. I'm not sure, we can flip through all the photos and see which ones might have a water tower.
It generally came when elevators came in, because then the buildings were too high for the pressure. And when
I need
these
to
were
interview
built,
all of you for my research.
and when these were built, we didn't have a city water system, obviously. They often had their own wells. But I had a question.
Sure.
So not to deviate too much from Fifth Avenue itself.
We could never.
But in order to have those nice corners, like where the Lennox and the Brevard mansions were, there needed to be 12th Street or 9th Street or whatever it was. Were those streets built out from the spine of Fifth Avenue around this, at the same time or around the same time? Because it would be kind of an odd thing that there'd be this avenue and nothing going to it, you know?
Yeah, you know, it varies. There are certain streets, like I know specifically 14th Street had a whole row along 14th Street going all the way to the corner, and that building, it was the side facade of the building that was the original, you know, quote unquote Fifth Avenue address, but it was really part of 14th Street. So some of those, and I think the same thing happened on 8th Street as well, where the rows, you know, extended further down the street, but then kind of folded into the avenue. But often, at least one, if not more, of those row houses were demolished in order to create the corner apartment building conditions that we see now.
And also with regard to the maps, it looked like there's some interesting sources for maps besides, you know, the New York Public Library, etc. But I know there were those insurance maps that
Yes.
came around at the
Fire
end of the
insurance
19th
maps.
for fire. And then there were those maps that were in the King's Handbook
Mhm.
for New York, which also gave the old property lines. And were you able to get access to those?
Yeah, the fire insurance maps, absolutely. I now can't remember, is it the Library of Congress or some other public, I don't know if you remember, Chloe, we use them all the time, but I can't think of what hyperlink I used to get there, but you can Google it and we can also share. But some of them might be also available through the New York Public Library, but it's a different collection that has those insurance maps. But yeah, there's a few different really interesting types of historical maps that we use for the Fifth Avenue project, but throughout all of our research at Village Preservation to kind of identify these early phases of what may have been constructed within the neighborhood. Thank you. Yes.
Just one more, like, practical question. Before there were any buildings, but after the grid had sort of been gone up, how was it kept straight, like, where the street was supposed to go? I'm picturing, like, surveyors tape, like, along imaginary lines.
There's a
like-
great book that talks about that called The Measure of Manhattan.
Well, we should add it to our resource.
No, seriously, and this
Yeah.
guy Randall did it, and he did all up to 155th Street,
Mhm.
and he was quite an eccentric man, but meticulous, and he did those mile markers and so forth, and he was often shot at or chased by dogs because he was on people's property, and they were generally not particularly happy about that.
Yeah, which is why it, at least along Fifth Avenue, and I'm sure many other parts of the city, took so long for them to finally acquire the full extent of what they wanted, because people didn't want to, concede any of their space to the city. What you were just saying about the kind of eccentricities of that man reminded me of this fellow who's our 1940s tax block and lot holder upper.
Yeah.
He's in many of these images, and I just always wonder what his life was like. Going to every single block of all 5 boroughs. It's kind of amazing. I don't know if it was only one man, but it was definitely only like 3 or 4, because they all look kind of familiar after a while as you look at these. Anyway, I would love to read a biography about the man behind this.
But all the mansions that were demolished, were there any, anything left somewhere where we could see what was in those mansions?
Well, I mean, I don't know about the ones that were fully demolished, but an example of the types of things that were there would be at the Salmagundi Club. I actually went upstairs into their library for the first time recently, and it's like more than a century old, just these incredible old books, predated the Dewey Decimal System, and you can see some of these like really great pieces of history there. Some of, the Lenox Mansion was briefly the original iteration of the Juilliard School. So my inkling would be that they might have some of the original holdings. I don't know if they do or not, don't quote me on that, but some of these places that had an institutional use or were connected to these more well-to-do families might have their holdings
Museum of
somewhere.
New York?
Yeah.
The Lennox one is also, wasn't it, part of he was a book,
Library.
he was a book
Yes.
collector, and a lot of the books ended up being like the beginning of the New York Public Library's holdings. There's also some photos of the interior of that building available.
Yes, I don't know if there's like physical ephemera somewhere, but we did see some really interesting interior photographs that at least show what was there.
One more question. Well, thank you very much.